Hello, welcome to another episode of the Sharpening Report. This is Jake Rahutsky in for Josh Peck. Got a very exciting guest with us tonight. Our guest tonight is Lieutenant Colonel Bob McGinnis. Thank you for joining us tonight, Bob.
Thanks for having me, Jake.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you coming on. So, Lieutenant Bob McGinnis, he's an expert on national security and foreign affairs. Hang on one second. Sorry, I've got audio feeding back through. There we go. So he's an expert on on security and foreign affairs. He worked at the Pentagon as an inspector general. He's also completed years of Fox News military analyst. He's a senior systems analyst with BCP International Limited. It's an Alexandria VA-based company where his primary duties involve working on multinational programs for the Department of the Army. Since October of 2002, he's been a member of Secretary Donald Rumsfeld's military analyst group, and Colonel McGinnis has served as vice president for policy with the Washington, D.C.-based Family Research Council. While he was there, he supervised a staff of policy experts and also served as the organization's expert for national security, foreign affairs, crime prevention, and drug policies. He's testified numerous times before congressional committees. He's also the author of Future War, which we're going to talk about tonight. It's also, that book is going to be available, or it's been available at Skywatch TV. So again, thank you for joining us tonight, Bob.
Well, thanks for having me, Jake.
Awesome. So let's start out with what we've kind of been seeing going on here the last few days. I saw another one tonight in Wisconsin. You know, everything here with this Trump election, it seems like you have some of these groups rising up that are basically, their goal is to protest our elected president. And again, we don't know who all is behind these protests, but give us just a little bit of your insight, Bob, on the past, some of the things you've seen, the agendas here, and maybe how this thing might play out or what they're aiming for.
Well, we know, Jake, because of the WikiLeaks material, that the Democratic Party evidently had hired a number of people to disrupt some of the Trump activities and rallies and the like. And so, you know, perhaps some of this is a collateral damage from that. It's hard to know. There's always going to be a losing party in a national election. There are people that feel as if they've been disadvantaged by the loss of Miss Clinton to Mr. Trump. They'll have to get over it, but you know, that's just the nature of politics. There's, you know, in the past, you know, we've somehow come to unify the country after bitter elections. This was a especially bitter election. You know, of course, Miss Clinton appears to have actually got the majority of the votes, but Mr. Trump won because he managed to get the majority of the electoral college, and that's the system that we have. So you're going to have winners and losers, and some people don't lose very well, so you have demonstrations and in some cases violence.
Yeah, absolutely. I was watching a little bit of this last night in Seattle. There was a shooting where I guess 5 people were wounded, and they're saying right now it's not linked directly to the protest, but people were basically burning stuff in the streets, blocking traffic, just doing a lot of illegal things. And the police were very gracious in this time. I know there's a lot of people that are upset. They're wounded over this loss. And so I think they're doing their best to try and just keep the situations calm and not escalate anything. There was no tear gas or anything like that used. But again, it just makes me wonder sometimes who's funding this stuff, because you know, you don't just have a group of people walking down the street and say, hey guys, let's protest the newly elected president. These things are usually well organized and funded by somebody. So whoever's behind it, obviously they have an agenda, and I guess we'll kind of see what that is as months go forward. And I hope that it ceases. I hope that this is just a short-lived thing and we can move on from this, because as you said, our country really needs to be unified and kind of come together after this strong division during the election cycle. So
Well, I think the President Obama is meeting with Mr. Trump in the Oval Office today. The certainly the pictures of that will get out, and you know, yeah, we have bitter divisions. The country seems to be split right down the center. Uh, but I suspect you'll see this begin to die down. The animosity toward Mr. Trump won't die down totally by any stretch of the imagination. It will be up to him to be the type of leader that really begins to unify the people. Well, but that's there will always be an element that won't be satisfied or happy with anything that he does or says.
Yeah, and I mean that's the case on both sides of the aisle, man. When you have the other guy in the office, there's going to be elements that both parties at some point are not going to entirely agree with most of what the person in office is doing. We're just kind of split down the middle right now. But I do hope, one of my hopes for President Trump being in office is that he will make good on a lot of the promises he's made and the things that he wants to do to help try and turn our economy around, to help increase our national security, borders, so on and so forth. I believe he has a huge amount to offer.
Well, he has certainly made a lot of promises, and of course, though he's new to politics per se, those promises are pretty significant. Closing down the border, certainly turning back Obamacare. Probably will sign a lot of executive orders reversing much of what Mr. Obama has done in terms of things like the EPA and the prohibitions on mining and the shipment of petroleum, whether it's through Keystone or some other means, exploration. I mean, the list goes on. And so 8 years of Mr. Obama is going to take a while for even Mr. Trump and a lot of ink in his pen to begin to reverse. But now that he has a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate, there's a good chance that some of this will quickly be in our rear view mirror, and we'll be able to move forward with many of the positive things. The stock market, of course, the last 2 days has shot up tremendously. On the hope that he's going to renegotiate things like NAFTA and PPT, that he's going to look at some of the imbalances in other trade relationships with China, about tariffs. There are just so many things that he can do to stimulate the economy, to create jobs. Certainly reducing the tax burden on a lot of small businesses. All of these things are key issues that came out during the campaign that he has promised to begin to address. And of course, keep in mind, he's got only, a little more than 2 months, 70 or so days until inauguration. And he and his to be determined administration have to hit the ground running. Because the world is not terribly forgiving to people that are unprepared to take over the world's most important country.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest elements in regards to the economics that he can help change is all the stuff we've done with China that you mentioned, giving all these tax breaks to China for trading with us, like not basically taxing the imports and all this. So China is able to undercut these local businesses. And then on the other hand, our local businesses do not have the tax breaks that they need to expand. So I think just doing those two things, tightening down and making the imports from China greater taxes on that, and then lowering the taxes for our local businesses and offering tax benefits for people employing will go a long ways in helping to re-stimulate economic growth. So let's talk about, Bob, then your newest book, Future War. I have a copy of it here. You came on Skywatch here a while back to talk about this book. It's available at skywatchtv.com. You guys can get it. Tell us a little bit about this book, Bob, and the background, kind of what made you originally want to write this book?
Yeah, Jake. Well, it was in anticipation, really, of the current election. I saw the country in a pretty dire circumstance. Things were not getting better. We just talked about the economy, certainly the national security, even the culture. We were just seen to be sliding downhill rapidly. You ask the average American, even today, are things getting better or getting worse? And the vast majority of Americans, and they have consistently said that things are getting worse. And they, of course, point fingers at the president, they point fingers at Congress. But, I suppose if you're underemployed or unemployed, if you don't feel safe in your neighborhood, if you see so many of these things at the national, international level just going in the wrong direction, you feel somewhat depressed, somewhat discontented. And so I said, okay, we need to look at that. And so what I did is I projected into the future about 20 years. And I, in the first third of the book, I go through and identify the mega trends, the game changers, some shifts, somewhat things I call black swans, like 9/11, the attacks on America was a black swan, an unexpected, significant event that perhaps if you'd known more about it, could have been prevented. And then all of these things lead to what I say is a new world order, over the next 15, 20 years. Now, we've already seen an evolution to a certain degree of that. The post-Cold War era, beginning in 1991, of course, up to that point, we were a bipolar world. You were either on the U.S. side or you were on the Soviet side. Well, with the demise of the Soviet Union, we became essentially a unipolar world for a short period of time. And then for unknown reasons, we, the United States, really didn't take leadership and began to mold much of the world in a way that probably should have been. And as a result, things have started to come apart at the hinges. And so this new world order that I'm suggesting, and with all these significant changes and trends and shifts, are going to lead to a world order that has, say, about 6 different countries that are going to be sharing power with non-government organizations, with intergovernmental organizations like the UN, with large corporations, with emergent terrorist organizations, and the decision-making cycles become very complex. And so in a world of, I would argue, that is really, sort of upside down for a lot of us, then we enter into a period in which we have what I call, in the second third of the book, 5 major threats. And those major threats are partly linked to ideology, but mostly linked to technology. Terrorism, it's going to be with us for decades, and it's going to morph into something more dangerous even than it is today with ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the like. Then you have the whole transhumanist movement. I call these the super soldiers, and the types of things that we're doing with taking technology and morphing it with human biology, the physiology of man, and you make a super soldier, an Iron Man of sorts. So I really delve into that to a great deal of detail. We look at space, and I would argue that this century will be known for space exploitation and a radical change, the militarization of space. I deal with the whole cyberspace threat, and most of us are concerned about our credit cards numbers being stolen or somebody robbing our bank accounts, but the issue of cyber technology and cyber war is far more complex and far more dangerous. And the last major threat is weapons of mass destruction. It's not just nuclear weapons, but it's biological, genetically produced, small weapons that can be put in the hands of individuals and groups that can be incredibly destructive. So you have these threats. So I started off by kind of saying, world's upside down. This is where we're going over the next 20, 30 years. These are the major threats and that are emerging that are going to really define why we're concerned and how we feel about risk and so forth. In the last part, I go through 6 chapters where I say, okay, having said all that, we've got to deal with the world in which we're inheriting. We have to deal with these threats. So we need to look at a national security strategy. And I go through how it's done in the United States and not only assessing what it looks like today, but suggesting how we ought to deal with it. And then I look at the intelligence arena with the 16 intelligence agencies and how they operate and the problems they have and what we ought to do to fix them to make them more effective. I look at the foreign policy. I look at the economy. I look at culture. And then, of course, all of that I do within the confines or the parameters of a biblical worldview. And I explain that up front. So 3 parts. Early on, where we're going with all these major changes, and I could go through those if you'd like. And then the 5 major threat areas that are going to have a lot to do with how we feel in the future, are the fears that we have, the risks that we have, and then what we ought to do. And I would argue what Mr. Trump and his administration must seriously consider the recommendations we make in there with regard to those areas that I outlined. So that's essentially the book in a few minutes of explanation.
Yeah. So the latest thing that we have here in regards to our security situation is obviously our borders, the opening of our borders. They've been open for a long time, where there's been a lot of people being able to flood into the country. Trump said he would build a wall and secure our borders. Is that alone enough, you think, at this point to stave off any possible attack that might be developed? Do you believe that there are entities, do you believe that there are terrorists that have flooded into this country already and they're just awaiting the commands? Or do you think we're not quite far enough down the road for that yet?
It's interesting. Just the other day, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, one of their commanders in Iran, announced that their intention is to infiltrate their operatives into the U.S. and Western Europe. Now, I have no doubt that they have attempted and probably have succeeded. We know we certainly have Hezbollah, which is a proxy of Iran, normally associated with operations south of Beirut and Lebanon, north of Israel. But they have a presence in countries in Central and South America. Their ability to infiltrate through Mexico into our country, there has been a number of reports that have suggested some of that. So yes, we know that we were infiltrated prior to 9/11 because those 19 hijackers came in here with the intent of killing as many of us as they could. There have been other indications, other reports from credible organizations in our government that have argued that they have captured or they've identified people that have infiltrated through our porous border. So, certainly it will be a point of some contention in the coming months when Mr. Trump takes over the presidency, and there'll be arguments as to whether or not he can in fact build the wall and make Mexico pay for it. But I think his central message is that, a nation needs strong borders if it's going to defend itself. Now, we've seen the tragedy of what's happened with the tsunami of immigration out of the Middle East and North Africa into Western Europe, and how that's turned a lot of, certainly Germany and France and Switzerland, Belgium, and the Netherlands and other countries upside down in terms of the jihadi that have found home and have taken advantage of the social services, have threatened and in some cases actually carried out terrorist attacks, whether it's the Brussels bombing or the Paris bombings or the 5 German jihadi that were arrested this week. Those sorts of things will continue. And I think we're just as vulnerable. I think it's a good idea to stop immigration, especially from certain points of the world, until we can figure out who is a bad guy and who isn't. If you look at the immigration that's come into Western Europe, the vast majority of the immigrants were young males of military age. That should be very disconcerting, as it has become for many Western Europeans, because they found that these people have perpetrated some pretty bad, crime waves and created chaos in certain of their communities. So these are things we ought to be concerned about. I think Mr. Trump is serious about doing something about mostly our southern border, which is the most vulnerable. I don't have any doubt that we've had some bad characters that have found their way into this country. Hopefully not too many, and then hopefully we can reverse this.
Yeah, absolutely. So looking in your book here, Bob, and we talked about earlier, what kind of you view as the coming super soldier in our nation here in the future, with mixing basically, we're looking at biotechnology, essentially combining man and machine. What are the advances right now? Like, how far along down this line of development are we currently?
Well, we have a number of organizations that work on it, but the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, is of course initially was a secret organization that essentially created the internet, GPS, stealth technologies. They've been on the cutting edge, and their mission set is essentially to keep the United States ahead of any potential adversaries in terms of technological development. Well, these people back in '85 were challenged by General Paul Gorman to help our future soldiers to be able to continue the fight in spite of being fearful and tired in the battlefield. And so they started to develop these, what I call exoskeletons, you wear outside of your body that increase your ability to run, to lift heavy weights, and the like. And then they started to work on chips that would be implanted in your brain. Initially, this was to help wounded veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan so that they could function. But the technology has gone well beyond that. So at some point, and we're not too far from that, in which you'll be able to do things just by thinking and controlling devices that may be attached to your limbs or external to your body. That's the sort of thing that we're looking at. And we'll be wearing suits. There's a new development called the Tactical Assault Light Operator Suit that's coming out next year in FY18. It's a full body ballistic protection, integrated heating and cooling system, embedded sensors and antennas and computers, and 3D audio, optics for vision day and night. It can inject a substance to control hemorrhaging if you're wounded and the like. I mean, this is something that has been worked on for some time and it's coming out. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. So you have these exoskeletons, like the one I just described. You have the chips that are being used for a variety of reasons, some of which are implanted in the brains initially for the purpose of helping wounded or disabled veterans to be able to function. But we've gone far beyond that with the science. Now, given that, Jake, one of the reasons that we have to stay on top of this is because our adversaries are doing precisely the same thing. And they don't bring to the table the same scruples and values that we tend to bring in there. In fact, some of these devices, you could argue that whether you have a human that is in charge of the decisions to use lethal force against an enemy, or it's being operated by an artificial intelligence, like some of the robots that are being developed today. We're moving in a way in which we've never been before when it comes to super soldiers, Iron Men, these whole transhumanist agenda. The technology is there. It's mind-blowing. It's like the comic books of 30 years ago, and it's in some cases even worse. So I go through a great deal of detail on a lot of the genetics, the experiments that have been done, what the implications are ethically and so forth. And I do a fairly good job of kind of laying out the future, and that future is right upon us.
Bob, wouldn't you agree kind of at this point that one of the greatest, let me say this. Okay, so not the greatest, but one of the weakest probably areas that we have in our defense as a nation is our nuclear weapons program, right?
Well, it has certainly deteriorated since the Cold War. Keep in mind, we've gone through a number of adjustments under the START agreements, and we've reduced the size of our arsenal, the number of platforms in which we launch weapons. Meanwhile, our adversaries, the Russians and the Chinese, and of course others, they've actually not been reducing their capability, but arguably have increased the capabilities that they bring to the table. I was considering a few minutes ago what those changes are that we've seen just in the last decade with Russia. Specifically, while we did virtually nothing to improve our arsenal, the Russians have fielded 2 new types of intercontinental ballistic missiles and 2 new types of submarine-launched ballistic missiles. That's very important, given that ballistic missiles, the technology, and just the fact that you have them, they deteriorate over time, much like the warheads. They have a new class of ballistic missile submarines. They have new air-launched cruise missiles that are nuclear capable. They have a new strategic bomber. They have new nuclear weapons capable of destroying the U.S. East Coast. And they retain thousands of non-strategic tactical nuclear weapons. Now, having said that, you also need to understand the Chinese have not been reducing, but have been increasing their capability. Their nuclear arsenal isn't anywhere close to the size of the Russians, because the Russians have much of what was left over from the Soviet era. But the Chinese have invested heavily in protection, and they're experimenting with anti-ballistic missile systems, space systems to protect them from incoming ballistic missiles. So we have 2 principal adversaries in the world today that have not stopped their investment. All the while, the Obama administration has cut back on our reinvestment, our modernization efforts, and this has really put our military in quite a pinch, and I think the country in some jeopardy.
Right. What do we have in regards to, because you mentioned before, outer space threats and risks associated kind of with, rather than space exploration, exploitation. What is it exactly that we're looking at there in regards to threats from space or threats operating in space?
Well, with regard to space, the whole militarization of space is something that I think is going to define this century. In the 1970s, it was the Russians that had a satellite that had something like a 50 caliber type of weapon aboard. It was the only, publicized weapon that was ever placed in orbit. And it was a clumsy weapon. You had to change the orientation of the entire manned, space station in the direction in which you wanted to fire. And I don't have any evidence that they actually fired it, but the Russians have acknowledged that they used it. But what we're beginning to see is, because we have directed energy weapon systems, lasers, that are incredibly effective today, that you're going to see more of those used in space, and then from space toward targets on the ground. So this is something that is emerging. The Chinese just this summer launched some argue a satellite that has an extended arm for the purpose of picking up space junk. Well, that same satellite can attach itself to another satellite and dismember that other satellite. So keep in mind, our country is totally dependent upon the constellation of satellites that orbit this Earth all the time. Our military especially, and the Russians and the Chinese are very aware of that vulnerability, and so they've started to develop a technology to go after that. We've seen in the last year plus both Chinese and Russian anti-satellites being tested. The Chinese especially have tested a couple times very successfully. So, from Earth, they have shot and destroyed a satellite, one of their own in these cases, and destroyed it in outer space. So if in fact they have that capability, that is another part of the militarization of space. So you can either fire from platforms up there toward the ground, or you can fire from down here and destroy our eyes and ears, or our ability to communicate, our ability to do much of the sophisticated things that we have to today. So space is changing. I think you're going to see efforts to land on asteroids, to exploit them for all sorts of minerals and the like. You'll have people going to the moon. You'll have larger space stations, and if we don't get on and accelerate some of our efforts, we're going to be left behind, and a lot of the benefits that come from what I'm describing will be lost to this country.
Well, that's interesting. Knowing that a lot of our systems are so obsolete in regards to our nuclear program. I know many of these are up to like 50 years old now, that we've just been sitting on the same thing. Plus, we've decommissioned many of our silos. Why is it, do you think, that we've taken the stance we have with Russia with this dangerous game in Syria, knowing that our systems are nearly obsolete? Like, what do you think that the administration, like, what is the whole goal there in Syria for people that don't understand the conflict there?
Well, the Syrian conflict, of course, arguably dates back to the Arab Spring that began, in 2010 in Tunisia, and spread to Libya, eventually to Egypt, and then, of course, all the way up to Syria, where you're talking about today. It was advertised as an uprising of people seeking democratic liberties in a part of the world which is unfamiliar with democracy. Well, arguably, that may be the case. However, it was the U.S. administration under Barack Obama who decided that he was going to turn his back on people like Omar Gaddafi, who was the leader in Libya, that frankly was our friend in terms of giving us intelligence and the like, but we turned our back on him, allowed him to be butchered in the streets. And of course, you've got the chaotic situation in Libya today, and some of which, in Sirte, which is a coastal town, has been occupied by ISIS. And of course, over the last 3-4 months, we've been bombing them, but they still have a presence there in at least 1 or 2 neighborhoods. So we lost Libya. We lost Egypt because Barack Obama turned his back on Mubarak, who was the president that may have not been the nicest of guys, but he was our thug that supported the U.S. and our interests. And so we went through the whole revolution and stood up the Muslim Brotherhood in Morsi, and eventually General Sisi basically pulled off a coup against that government, got himself elected, and it's remains rather chaotic in that part of the world. But we backhanded a good friend by the name of Mubarak, and then of course supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, and now Sisi, who was the chief general over there, has become cozy with the likes of Vladimir Putin in Russia. Well, all of this, of course, preceded to a certain degree the civil war that started in 2011 in Damascus, when Bashar Assad, decided that protests weren't going to be permitted, and like his father before him, started to use the army to suppress the demonstrations. That one thing led to another, and so 5 years later, we've had more than 500,000 people killed in Syria. And of course, this is in the wake of people like Hillary Clinton claiming that as Secretary of State, we could work with Assad. Certainly, the present Secretary of State, Kerry, argued that he's a moderate. Assad is a moderate, someone that we could work with as well. Obviously, we haven't done all that well in working with them, and certainly keeping that country from imploding. So today, you find that though we have a presence, mostly special forces, and then overflights and bombing out of Incirlik in Turkey, and then of course some of the airfields in Iraq, the Russians a little over a year ago, a couple months ago, joined the fray. And they did that because they wanted to bolster Assad. Assad had given them territory, and certainly the port of Tarsus. The Russians are feeling their oats, and they want to have more say in that part of the world for a variety of reasons, some of which have to do with just simple geopolitics, but also of intimidating the West. And it's also a distraction to a certain degree as to what the Russians did in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, and what they're doing all the way to the Baltics. So you have all of these issues that are coming to bear. Our argument for being in Iraq and Syria these days, of course, is ISIS, that is now on its heels to a certain degree, as Iraqi security forces are taking back Mosul, which is going to take arguably probably a couple more months, just because of the nature of the enemy in Mosul and the size of the city. Same thing is true of Raqqa, Syria, which is a so-called capital of the caliphate of ISIS. But once those cities are taken back, many of the ISIS jihadi will fade into the environment. They won't disappear, but they'll fade into local countrysides. They're Sunni by definition of the strand of Islam. Having said that, then the real problems begin, because who's going to control these areas? It's going to be the Kurds. It's going to be the people in Baghdad, people in Ankara. You see, if you go back 100 years, at the end of World War I, right before that, the Ottoman Empire claimed most of the area that is now northern Syria and northern Iraq. And it was never really settled. The treaty that ended World War I did divide up the region between France and England. And of course, there were artificial lines drawn, and the Ottomans, the Turks, felt slighted. Of course, they'd been on the wrong side in that war, and so they had to suffer the consequences. But now they're reemerging. They're working, interestingly, with the Russians. They're working against the Iraqis and against Bashar Assad to a certain degree. And meanwhile, you probably have 100 different small jihadi groups that are fighting them on one side or another, and it's hard to tell from day to day whose side they're on. So it is a chaotic situation that's not going to be reconciled soon, and the tensions will continue probably for years and years.
Well, and it's, I guess what kind of blows my mind is, 1 minute a particular brand of ISIS is our enemy. The next minute they're our friends and they're fighting for us. Same thing with Al Qaeda and some of these other terrorist organizations. I just don't understand how we can go back and forth with these people as enemies and friends in these hostile territories and then just pick your brand of which one's the bad guy in the following years. I guess most people, I guess, think just the American people just have a short memory in regards to this stuff, so they can just do it. I mean, what's give a little insight on that, Bob?
Well, it depends upon the battlefield. You think of Yemen, for instance. It's a desperately poor country. Yet on the southwest corner of the Arabian Peninsula, Arabian territory, it has a proxy called the Houthis that is associated with the regime in Tehran, and they're of a Shia flavor, an Islamic Shia following, and they're battling against Sunnis to a certain degree that are aligned with the Saudis that have a particular brand of Salafi, Takfiri, Sunni Islam. And then in the mix, you have Al Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula, which has been a perpetrator of a lot of bad stuff. So you've got a complex battlefield down there as well, with a number of nations. We fly drones, and we use those drones with Hellfire missiles to knock out some of the bad guys that threaten our interests. But we're not engaged as the Saudis with ground troops and with U.S. Jet fighters. We usually just rely upon drones. But it's a complex arena with a lot of players with a lot of different agendas. Yemen's like that. Certainly Egypt and the Negev, the Sinai, have Bedouins running around, some of which are aligned with ISIS or Al Qaeda. You have, of course, the Saudis have their own problems with those various flavors. Then, of course, we've described Iraq and Syria, but Jordan has issues, and it's in the smack in the middle of all this fighting. So when you try to piece this together, I think we need to recognize that these tensions have been around for millennium, thousands of years, and as a result, they're likely to continue. And it's going to be a desperate effort by us if we continue to try to go in there and to spend our blood and treasure to separate these entities, because I don't know that you're ever going to completely help them reconcile their differences. The Shia hate the Sunni, and the Sunni hate the Shia. The Kurds, don't get along with anyone. The Turks, though they're Sunni, they certainly don't like the Iranians. And of course, in the middle of all this is Israel. And they're looking at all sorts of sides, and they don't see anybody that's friendly. So it is not going to be resolved anytime soon. And that's why a lot of us argue that, and understandably, as you look at, say, Ezekiel 38 and so forth, that that area is ripe for the end time scenarios that we often talk about.
Yeah, it's just interesting to me that this is, the day that we're living in now. And obviously, as you said, this has been going on for a long time, since the days of Isaac and Ishmael. These other countries and some of these regions are actually the blood brothers of Israel, going back. So the feud goes back to the house of Isaac and Ishmael, before the split there. But let's go forward a little bit here, because I was looking in your book. You were talking about national intelligence for the 21st century. Given that we've had all this terrorist stuff going on, we have newer threats, there's newer weapons and stuff like that being developed. Where are we headed from a national security perspective, and how do you think that that's going to influence the civilian population in regards to the borders between who do we spy on and who do we not spy on?
Well, a lot depends upon what the Trump administration does in terms of, securing our border, as he's promised. How you employ your intelligence services. Your intelligence services are outwardly focused. The Central Intelligence has people overseas. They have other assets. National Security Agency has satellites, has listening devices. What we have classically lacked, I would argue, for decades, have been the necessary human intelligence, something the Israelis learned a long time ago, that you really can't replace human intelligence with certainly wiretaps or satellite imagery and the like, because it's the human that's been on the ground for 20, 30 years that is a trusted agent inside an organization that understands, the individuals, that understands, perhaps what they're thinking and planning. That's all valuable information for our decision makers. And, so we've weakened our capabilities because we have not invested as heavily as we should in human intelligence. Now, that's something that we can begin to fix, but we won't fix it very quickly. And the technologists, will continue to insist that, whether it's signals intelligence or it's some type of pictures that we're making on satellites or through other special devices, that's the answer. I disagree. I think it's part of a broader answer. So the intelligence community perhaps can be more streamlined, as I address in Future War. I don't know that we really need 16 discrete intelligence agencies, some of which duplicate the same effort. Certainly, we don't want them spying on U.S. citizens, and that's something I address in Future War as well. And I think that's a real possibility, as clearly we've seen. They're vacuuming up all the telephone calls in the country, or the emails or the like. Our privacy is out the window, and there are all sorts of Fourth Amendment issues here that I think that we need to be concerned about. So we need to rein them in, but give them enough power and enough the right oversight to help the country defend itself. And then foreign policy, I think we can do a lot better in terms of who we associate with, who we trade with, who we trust. We need to, I wrote a book, Never Submit, on the genocide of Christians in the Middle East. And, there's no reason why we should continue to tolerate countries like Saudi Arabia and much of the Middle Eastern countries that are just discriminate against Christians and allow their people to treat Christians as second-class citizens. And of course, in some cases, they don't let them worship at all, like Saudi Arabia. Can't have a church, can't wear a cross, can't carry a Bible. And of course, that just fed the genocide of Christians in places like Iraq and Syria, where we've seen the emergence of ISIS that crucified Christians, buried them alive. I mean, they just devastated the entire Christian community. So these are issues of some consequence that we need to be concerned about, whether it's national security, intelligence, foreign affairs. These are all issues I address in Future War, and I lay out, I think, a very clear way ahead that I'm hoping that the Trump administration will pay close attention to.
Absolutely. I hope so as well. So in closing up here, Bob, we're getting close to the top of the hour here. Someone in our live chat asked a question I thought was quite interesting, and I don't know what your answer is going to be or what your take will be on it, but they were basically asking, with the advances of technology, we talked about the transhumanism stuff and drones and all these artificial intelligences that are being developed. Do you think that we could ever be looking at a Skynet scenario if the advancing technologies are developed? If you're familiar with the Skynet scenario, which is basically these artificial intelligence basically take control and aim their weapons at us.
Well, and that is a concern. It's interesting that we had General Silva, who is the deputy chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said only weeks ago that he is concerned about embracing artificial intelligence and linking it to a kinetic weapon system. In other words, a robot that learns and thinks for itself. Now we have capabilities that are almost there. The issues that we have, of course, is we want to put a human in that interface. We don't want that artificial intelligence robot, if that's what you want to call it. I don't call it a cyborg, because cyborg is a combination of a human and a robot capabilities or non-human capabilities. But for instance, right now we use drones, and we have a human that is making the decision as to where the drone flies and the engagement with a Hellfire missile or whatever missile system they're using that is ultimately killing somebody on the ground. We want a interface with a human. The Chinese, Russians aren't doing that. They've been experimenting with some of this technology in ways that make the future battlefields very frightening. And of course, that's where DARPA comes in. DARPA, we have to figure out how to counter these AI devices that are beginning to likely show up on the battlefields. We've seen a few. I talk about some of the discoveries we've made on some current contemporary battlefields in future war. We haven't quite seen the type of technologies that I anticipate that are on the drawing boards, and in some cases are already being experimented with. But that's the real fearful thing that I see in the future.
Give us just a quick peek, Bob, into your book of what the most disturbing piece of experimentation being done is, according to your research, and what they may be looking at.
Well, I go through a whole bunch of past experiments, and some of the current ones are of course, I would argue some of the worst are probably very, very secret. But we've used human beings for certainly radiation tests, chemical warfare tests. Of course, we knew the Nazis did a lot of bad stuff. The Russians, the Soviets did a lot of things. The North Koreans used POWs for some pretty dastardly tests. I would argue that there is evidence of some genetic engineering, and that has some very frightening implications. If you go into an ethics-free or value-free environment where an efficient killing device is really what your end state is, and you don't have to worry about whether or not it's going to kill without remorse, then these are things that I see in the future. Now, if they're in many cases they won't be earthbound. Some will be earthbound. Others will be able to fly. Some of them probably will be above the earth with technologies that can engage targets on Earth. These things sound like science fiction. They are not, unfortunately. They are real. And the technology is really expanding every year, and the killing capabilities of individuals and groups is expanding every year as well.
Interesting. Well, Bob, it's been a fascinating conversation. I know your schedule is very busy, and I appreciate you taking the time to join us here at the Sharpening Report, and I look forward to the next time we see you at Skywatch Studios. So thank you very much for joining us, and tell everybody where they can get your book and all your information.
Well, Jake, as you know, Future War is available there through Skywatch, Defender Publishing. You can get it on Amazon. You can go to Barnes & Noble. It's out there. And of course, if people want to follow me, they can go to my Facebook page, just facebook.com /RL McGinnis, MAGINNIS, and they'll see, interviews like this, interviews I've done on Skywatch or on Fox News or a variety of venues. And, I write a daily blog on kind of what's going on in the Middle East. And some people find that fascinating as well.
Awesome. Well, hang on with me as we go off air here, Bob. And guys, until next time, this has been Jake in for Josh Peck on the Sharpening Report, and Lieutenant Colonel Bob McGinnis has been our guest tonight. Thanks, guys. God bless.